As you know, today's forum is titled Paths to Humility. And as we'll discuss in the course of the forum, maybe that's not the right title, but we'll get to that. I'm going to put the queries up on the screen one at a time because I find the whole document may be a distraction, so you can focus on one query at a time. Of course, I have to be able to find it. I think this is it. Okay. Everybody can see the screen share, but everybody's muted. Okay. Unless if you can't, unmute yourself and tell us, please. So as you've seen in the background, the reason for this forum is twofold. One is looking at early friends. They often mention walking in meekness and humility so that their contemporaries would be fully open to leadings of the indwelling light. And the second reason is more current, and that is it seems that humility is in short supply today. If you think about our public discourse and you look at the language we use with each other and our tendency to self-indulge, the fact that we all work too much, or most of us do, and the compulsion we have to control everything around us, all of those are antithetical to what I think is our understanding of humility, and we'll test that understanding with these queries. The first query is, what do we mean by the term humility? Is it a goal to be achieved? Is it something that we can arrive at by following paths to humility, as the title suggests? And please speak out of the silence as you're led to do so. I'll go ahead and give you the other choice. The other choice, as opposed to a goal to be arrived at, is it's something to be built into our daily lives, so we speak more of paths of humility rather than to.
Well, this is Terry, English. I'm not sure you've really asked us to compare the two, but I believe that a path in humility is more attainable than a path to humility. We're constantly being confronted by challenges, and we need to let go of any arrogance or smugness, perhaps, that we may have in our attempt to solve problems, and depend on the light to guide us.
no one else has a thought on this they want to share, why don't we start from that premise that humility is a matter of how we are in the world, as opposed to I'm going to make myself a humble person, and when I get there, I'll know it. So the next query that is suggested by that, minimize here, is striving for humility consistent with humility itself? In other words, is there a certain arrogance involved in striving to be humble and thinking that we can make that decision and we can make the effort, and in doing so, we can reflect humility? We live in humility by our own efforts and choices. The other option, the other part of the query is, or is grace a necessary ingredient in the recipe for humility, understanding grace to be the light?
I may be off base on this, but I think I would parse those last two questions a bit differently. I don't think there's anything unhumble about realizing your own faults. And in fact, I suspect that that's one of the ways in which grace operates. That is, it's like, oh, that's what I'm doing. I better fix that. So grace, it's like we don't get humility without some kind of effort, but it's part of it's repair. It's realizing that we have to change how we act and how our character is. And then, like everything else we do, failing the first 100,000 times we do it. But I don't see how that effort itself undercuts humility.
So do we arrive at that realization of our failings with the assistance of grace? Okay. Just want to make sure I understood correctly.
Julian, I think at least we can be aware of our arrogance and belief that we have all the answers, and that might be a beginning of the path to humility. Those are things that we as mortals without divine intervention can begin if we see humility as a goal.
I believe some Quaker or the other said, let love be the first motion. And I think that if we start from that place, that motion, then if we seek to do God's will from that first motion, humility will naturally follow.
On Larry's point about love, I think it was Woolman at one point who wrote about it all basically coming down to two things: love of God and love of neighbor. And once you get to that point, everything else kind of falls into place. Other thoughts about the recipe for humility?
Well, I don't see it really as a heroic effort, something we strive for its own sake. I think that at any time a person who has qualities of leadership or intelligence or wants to solve a problem is reminded through grace and through being reminded to take a loving approach, that humility and listening to others, which I think is part of humility, is called for to counteract arrogance or a tendency to try too hard and to make heroes of ourselves instead of facilitators and team members. So I like this way Grace is brought in here on B. I think it is necessary, but it's a part of other recipes like baking soda or, dare I say, salt. Not a goal in itself, because that makes of the person trying so hard to be humble a hero of some sort, a sort of self-righteous holier than thou. I think some people pretend to be more humble than they are, or they pretend humility, and they end up just being lazy or not contributing what they could to solving a problem out of fear of perhaps appearing arrogant or knowing all the answers.
One of the difficulties of seeing humility as a destination, it seems to me, is that basically once we get there, we'll know it, and then we can consider ourselves humble. Well, if you consider yourself humble, do you have humility? Considering yourself humble necessarily is in the context of other people. And so you consider yourself humble, that may well mean that there are others you consider not humble. And then you get into the trap of lacking humility. I wanted to pick up on a term that Sally used, and that is arrogance, and drill down a little bit and just ask folks, what forms does arrogance take in our lives? I just mentioned judging others, but if we've got we walk into the post office and there are wanted posters for examples of arrogance, what would the names of those wanteds be? Not that we want them, but in search of. How about putting self before others? Maybe a form of that being covetousness. I see Rachel's raising her hand, and I can't see that the way I've got the screen set up. Rachel.
Okay, well, I would just say that to me, grace and humility are really realizing that we don't control our own destiny, that anything, gifts that we have are given are for the use of all. It's really about being in community. And so then what you're saying about arrogance is really to believe that any good thing that happens to us or comes to us is for our own use. Not to realize that not only is it for us to benefit the community, but that we are constantly, the reason we are here because of other people, and that we are in a community.
I think it was Ian McAdams at the end of the San Antonio worship who cited the text in Scripture, not mine, but thy will be done. And while a lot of us may not use that language, submitting to the fact that we don't control everything that's going on around us, and it may be within a control that we don't understand, is a way of expressing humility. Other thoughts on this query?
Because one worry I always have is that I feel like when we believe that we have grace and we know the will of God, that can be the most arrogant thing one could believe.
You're asking about like different kinds of arrogance. I think the worst kinds are the kind that combine with materialism, because it kind of leads into worse things that way. And another form of arrogance that's particularly damaging is toxic masculinity.
Picking up on Nikki's reference to excessive attachment to material things, and falling back on Woolman, who made an explicit link between what I'll call greed and depression, which is the product of somebody wanting more than they need, so those who need don't get that, and then oppression leading to war. In thinking about depression, clearly somebody who oppresses somebody else is putting themselves above that person and is not humility. And someone who is engaged in war and intent on winning over somebody else, similarly lacking in humility. Say that's not a statement of fact, that's just my opinion. Otherwise, I'd be arrogant. I probably am sometimes anyway. But well, in the deference to time, why don't we move on? And we can always come back to these if folks have thoughts that are generated by subsequent queries. And we just roll back to previous queries. This is sort of the flip side of the discussion of arrogance. What can practical humility look like in our everyday lives? Rachel.
Well, I think one thing, so often we think about people who aren't humble to try to do more than their talents allow, but I think also part of that is to realize when you do have something you can do well and can contribute, that you should. It's not arrogant to actually do what you can in the community and recognize that you have a gift or a talent, and that's the reason for it, not to brag about it, but just to realize that everyone can contribute their gifts and talents to, because that's what forms a community.
Someone takes those talents and devotes them to the well-being of others in the community. Uh, Talents for organizing a peace vigil, or talents for working for justice uh, in the prison system. They're taking that time and energy, applying it to those activities at a cost to themselves. They're putting others above themselves, and that cost is time is not spent on something they'd like to do, learning to cook, being at home with family, and their energies are also put toward the well-being of others. And so they may not have as much energy for the kids as they'd like to, but they feel the kids are getting what they need, and therefore they can devote those energies elsewhere. Walter.
So, been contemplating whether to share this or not. One reason being I'm fasting today, so my brain's not working in full gear. But many years ago, I read an essay by Joyce Carol Oates that had a big impact on me, and in some ways the way I think about humility. She was writing about Simone Weil, who was, many of you may be familiar with, who's a sort of spiritual philosophical writer, mid 20th century, died, mid 20th century, had a short life, but was a prolific spiritual writer, kind of a mix of Jewish and Christian background and influence in her writing and mysticism and so forth. And she was a member of, or participant in the French underground, I believe, during the war, but had to flee to England, and where I think she lived in London, and she continued to do some organizing from there. And she felt a great sense of responsibility and I don't know exactly, I don't want to describe what her feelings might have been, but what she did was that she expressed solidarity with her colleagues and friends who were still in France, who were still in the underground, still at the mercy of the Nazis and being chased and so forth. She expressed solidarity with their lack of provisions and their whole situation by fasting, and she limited herself to the amount of food that she believed that they had access to, so that this is a way of her sort of being in solidarity with them and giving of her whole self to their situation. And she died ultimately, I think, in part because of the fasting and damage to her health that may have been precarious in other ways before she did that. And so Joyce Carol Oates kind of in this essay that I read, evaluated all that, and kind of took Simone Weil to task. And when I think about humility, you can't talk about humility without, as many have already suggested here, that it's without setting it in the context of relationship. It's about relationship. It's humility vis-a-vis whom. So Joyce Carol Oates basically made a distinction between love and pity. And these are relational nouns or verbs that they describe how we are vis-a-vis each other. And she criticized essentially Simone Weil for not loving, but being involved in pity, and which has pity is better than no pity, but it always has a hierarchical. It always indicates a hierarchical relationship where the person who is pitying another is in some way above that other. And Joyce Carol Oates was basically saying that, suggesting, I think, that Simone Weil was pitying her colleagues, and this was causing her to do something that was actually self-destructive. And that, the best way to be in solidarity would be to try to do everything one could to end that which was oppressing her colleagues, which she was doing as well. I've thought many times about how, in various occasions, various settings, how that distinction between love and pity, shows up. And one of them, I think, that's a very telling place that we're all familiar with is during the practice of Texas executions. And for years, there's a big issue right now at the Supreme Court where John Ramirez, a Texas inmate, is asking the court to recognize his right to have his own spiritual advisor present in the room and touching him and verbalizing something at the time that he's having his execution, the time he's being killed by the state. And this arises out of a long tradition going back centuries of clergy participation in executions, going back to the Inquisitions, when, and up through the history of the U.S. colonies, where the goal really of clergy participation was to secure a conversion of the person who is going to be killed by the state before that happened. And it was a mutual display of power of the state and the church working together. The clergy in Texas who participated in executions as members of the chaplain corps for years didn't see themselves as participating in that power structure. They often articulated how it's really important that somebody who's being killed should have somebody there who's friendly with them to accompany them at the time. But they were members of the power structure, and what they were doing, and they were assisting their presence was assisting the guards, it was assisting this killing to take place. And so I can't think of a more profound expression of pity than that. And I also think that when we see the end of the death penalty will be accompanied by the chaplains, the spiritual advisors, and such refusing to participate entirely, and exposing the ritual for what it is. I think that there's I can't think of a more profound illustration of that distinction between love and pity, and the choices that one must make between them in every relational event that we have in our lives. And therein lies a choice for humility, whether we're going to find ourselves above the person that we are relating to or with them and for them.
Anyone have thoughts stimulated by Walter's contribution?
I'm wondering, Walter, you mentioned that you were fasting today, and I'm just wondering how that relates to Simone Weil and this pity, and what is it that you're going for with that?
Tomorrow I'm going to have a semi-violent every 5-year medical thing done to me that I have to fast for in advance.
So no, okay, fair enough. No.
That's why I wasn't at meeting today as well. So,
Thank you, Walter. I had forgotten that piece about Simone Weil, but my mentor, Professor Caroline Whitbeck, also a friend, in Cambridge meeting and then in Cleveland, where she was distinguished professor, Caroline Whitbeck used to talk a lot about Simone Weil. And I went through a spell of kind of anorexia, bulimia, but now I'm, quite plump. And it's a burden. And I've often thought that I should be fasting, but I had developed diabetes when inactive for a hip replacement. And so I really shouldn't fast as a diabetic. So it's always been a quandary to me. And I know that it's kind of healthy to fast occasionally. And I have fasted for medical tests too. But thank you for relieving me of the guilt of not fasting. But we can still be mindful and not so arrogant with our food. And I want to say, with regard to humility in our bodies and the physical, the rest of nature, so including what we eat, there's a wonderful poem that was in a collection I edited as a festschrift by the poet, I think it's David Ferry, who talked about, and none of the other contributors to the volume who reviewed it understood what this meant, but he talks about being in the woods, in the forest alone, and our loud bodies standing. Our loud bodies standing in the woods. And no one could seem to understand this, and I understand it, I think, being that we're so much a disturbance mostly to the rest of nature, that the birds sometimes get quiet when we show up. And we have loud bodies to the other, if we're, not fully accepted. Although here we have so many butterflies and birds, they don't seem to mind my loud and fat body. We have chachalacas and orioles and titmice. Anyway, our loud bodies standing is a form of our arrogance, and not knowing that our bodies are loud to the rest of nature. It helps us avoid humility. So, and I think there's humility in my partner always having been a vegetarian since he was 18. Although at times it seems like self-righteousness again, because he doesn't like to tolerate a turkey roasting or bone broth preparation, and calls it Gummi Adler, rubber chicken. So I don't know whether our relationship to the rest of the world as consumer humans is also arrogant and needs humility, and what exactly that would look like in our daily lives. To answer question 3.
Terry? I can't see whether you're muted, Terry.
Oh, sorry, there was some little glitch that happened when you said my name, so I wasn't sure which name you said. I will not preface this with in all humility, because it's probably very arrogant of me, but I do disagree with Walter, and I'd like us to reflect on the fact that it's considered rather tragic that so many people have died alone because of the COVID-19, and that all of us, I imagine, want to be with our loved ones when they are dying, and we hope to have loved ones with us when that moment arrives. I should think it would be just human decency for someone to be the friend, the ally of the person being executed, no matter what everyone else may think of it, and really no matter that the state, with our money in our name, is committing that crime. And think of the people who have died with the COVID-19, separated from their family and friends, and some of them may have been inadvertently killed by a careless person who doesn't believe it's a real pandemic. Other people die alone because of traffic accidents, and it's probably much more comfortable to have someone who cares about you be with you at that moment.
Thoughts about practical humility before we move on?
Just like to respond to Terry briefly.
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, what she was describing is what we all you know have as fellow feeling for each other, and absolutely the need to have someone present in one's last moments is a profound of profound importance. But there's a difference between a killing and a dying, and so I think a way that certainly works to make that difference known and to not participate in the killing is to be present in a way in which one is not participating in the killing. And so when executions occur, certainly a spiritual advisor who's present in the witness room is a totally different thing than a spiritual advisor who's in the chamber participating with the guards, the wardens, and the executioners.
And before we move on, I'd like to go back to the Oates-Weil debate. I think one way to look at this is to go back to the notion that one example of humility is to walk in another's shoes. And it's also, I think, considered an expression of love, particularly, again, with the early Quakers who were encouraging their contemporaries to return to primitive Christianity. The idea that they wrote about in their journals and so forth was that we take on the suffering of others. And certainly in the Simone Weil example, fasting, in fasting, she was deliberately taking on the suffering of others. And again, with the early Quakers, if you took on the suffering of others, you were basically removing from the huge pile of, I want to call it debris, but huge pile of things that we do in the outer world that they considered as obscuring the inner light. And the more you could get away from that pile and dig your way to the inner light, go low, the more likely you would be able to live a life that was led by the light. So this is not a modern perspective for most folks, but it is I think, a reminder to us that putting ourselves in the shoes of others, whether it's fasting or chaining ourselves to detention center, whatever the action may be, does have is a way of expressing love and does have the capacity to bring us closer to the light. I want to make sure to leave room for anybody to respond to that. Again, we can come back to that if folks want to. We may not get to the last query, and that's fine, because I think number 4 is more important, and I can just explain the last query before we end. I think it was Val Live Oak who responded to this query when she responded to the email that went out about the forum, because it is designed to get us to think about where humility fits in with the various testimonies. So in the case of simplicity, the examples of simple living that reflect humility may be something like passing on things that we consider luxuries because our enjoying luxuries are probably related to somebody else not making a living wage because they're too busy and they're working too hard trying to supply those luxuries. In Woolman's time, it was silver vessels, the example that he chose. But what other examples of simple living are reflective of humility? And let's just open this up to all the testimonies. Anybody who has thoughts about humility embedded in any of the testimonies. I think we already heard from someone about community. What about the other testimonies? Is living the testimony of equality an exercise in humility because we are not putting ourselves above anyone else?
Well, if I could share, I know I visited y'all in San Antonio for your fall retreat and shared that whenever I've gone by there, I go there occasionally every season to photograph some of the plants you have there. And I've noticed how much the people using the via bus routes will detour through where you have the Monarch Way station and the garden there just to have that moment of peace in their day, because you have that bus route on Eisenhower Road directly across the street. Well, I guess there's a bus stop on the side where the meeting house is too, but there's one directly across the street. And then one long block south, there's several bus routes on Austin Highway, but so many times I've noticed people leaving a bus route or leaving the apartments across the street when I've been there. And then they actually slow down and take a moment to detour through that garden. And then they pick up their pace and rush, walking faster down to Austin Highway to get there before the next bus. But that, I think, is a testimony to basically everything you have listed, just the presence of that, and that it's accessible to people who are actually there in the community.
I feel like the testimony of equality is helpful with humility. I think one of the dangers in humility is that it ends up in an unequal place, that instead of putting yourself above someone, you want to put yourself below them in terms of, oh, I'm going to be more humble than them. And I'm like, I remember reading, it's like, I think The Little Flowers of St. Francis, these apocryphal stories, and he's like asking people to walk on his neck, and just like these like almost farcical degrees of sort of self-abasement and humility that I think are just ends up being kind of the opposite of humility. And I think equality is a better place to find humility in. Just realizing not that I'm necessarily that much worse than any of you or that much better, but that we're sort of more or less all struggling with various things and confused most of the time.
That's what Joyce Carol Oates was getting at.
About sustainability, taking seriously our obligation to care for the small letter C creation. The opposite of the doctrine of dominion. I remember hearing from one of my classmates in Utah that she believed that people were given, she said man, but people were given dominion over the creation of the capital C, and therefore were expected to exploit its resources for their own benefit. So Earth Care, I have a counterpoint to that.
Yeah, I mean, that's arrogance and the opposite of humility, in thinking that we have dominion over the other species, that we're in any way superior and can do more important things than they can. I mean, bees can tell you the distance, they can tell each other the distance to the nectar and how far it is with a dance. And many other creatures can do things we can't do. And we don't have dominion. We have, the original Hebrew word was care for, not dominion over. And the dominion over came with the King James translation of the Bible. But it certainly had a lot of uptake. And humility then in environmental consciousness would be to not see ourselves as having dominion at all.
Well, we're closing in on 1 hour, and we usually limit these forums to 1 hour. Of course, if anybody wants to continue, I'm happy to continue to participate in the discussion. Anybody have anything they want to add on query number 4? Okay, just to explain query number 5 and leave it with you for your own consideration. It occurred to me in writing these queries that to ask whether the queries were spirit-led and whether the responses to the queries necessarily were spirit-led. And if we look at the process of considering queries, coming up with queries and considering them as spirit-led, it may be a case of lacking humility, because from my perspective, putting together the queries for today was an exercise of the human intellect, and an exercise resulting from study and human reason and thought. And therefore, thinking that they're the result of anything else would not be humble in an important way. And so perhaps the answer is to go through this exercise and then go back and ask and try to spend some time in discernment. Are these the right questions? are these, where is the spirit in these questions? And if it's not in these questions, in what questions might we find it? Yeah, similarly with the discussion on each query, we could go back as a second stage, a second step, and ask the same question. So let's enter into some silence, and then when we come out of the silence, if anybody would like to continue the conversation, we can certainly do that. Thank you, friends.
Thank you, Julian.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. A good forum.
So I had one more thing to add, if I may. It seems to me that willful ignorance is an essential component of arrogance. And by that, I mean contempt prior to investigation. It's not necessary to investigate the things we don't know about, because that's impossible. But it is necessary that we rigorously examine all avenues of information before adopting a position.
Terry. English. You're muted, Terry.
I was just doing a thumbs up
Okay.
for Larry Kelly Mahappy. Good comment.
James's comment about self-abasement or devaluing the self as opposed to arrogance is just as lacking in humility as arrogance, and brought to mind the term self-denial. And I've always thought about self-denial as a matter of saying, I'm going to do without something that I like, because somehow that's going to make me a better person. And in my reading, I've come across, or it's been clear to me that there's another way to think about the term self-denial, and that is again in the context of what Ian mentioned in the San Antonio, after the San Antonio session, and that was every time that we take an action that denies the self, not necessarily depriving ourselves of something, but denies the self, It is an act of placing